Welcome back everyone to another setup video for SRX, the game. And in today's video, we're focused on the 305 cars. And rather than go track by track and do individual setups that way, I have found that a base setup really works well for me. So that's what we're going to talk about in today's video. Not only the setup, but most importantly, we're going to talk about how to adjust it from track to track to get the best performance based on your driving style. A couple of things to keep in mind before we get into the specifics of the setup. First being, this is a baseline setup, which means that it's not track specific. This is what I start with whenever I go to a new track, and then I will make adjustments based on the track itself. Things like how big is the track, how tight are the corners, how much banking do you have, and so on. Those are all specific things about each track that will cause me to make different changes to the setup, and we'll talk about those as we move throughout each area of the car. The second thing is the setup is going to be specific to your driving style. So what we're looking at here is specific to the way I like to drive the car. And in my case, I'm not necessarily worried about full throttle all the way around the track, even though I can at most every track. That's generally not the way I prefer to drive it because it's generally not the fastest way for me to make lap time. So generally the way I will enter each corner, again, this varies on track by track, but generally I will lift off the throttle just a little bit and tap the brake to settle the front end of the car, get the car pointed the way I want it, and then I'm full throttle for the remainder of the corner, again, in general. So keep those things in mind as we move throughout each area of the car, and realize that if you drive the car very different from me, then your setup is likely going to need to be very different from what I'm using. As we move into specifics of each corner of the car and also front to rear adjustments, remember that for me, these cars drive very loose. It is very easy for them to over-rotate based on my driving style. So if your driving style varies greatly from mine, then you might need a very different style of setup. But again, for me, it's all about controlling the rotation because these cars are very easy to over-rotate. So a lot of the adjustments that you're going to see and the specifics of this setup are to control the rotation and tighten up the car overall. But of course, as we go corner by corner, we'll talk about ways to loosen and or tighten up the car in general so you can adjust the car to your liking and based on your driving style. Starting off with the torsion bars. Think of the torsion bars as springs in more of a NASCAR style car. So if you're familiar with my setup videos in the NASCAR Heat series, then think of the torsion bars as I talk about the springs. So if you want more weight on that particular corner of the car, then increase the torsion bar. That would be similar to increasing the spring rate on a particular corner. So think of the torsion bars again as the springs in a more traditional asphalt type car. If you're like me and you don't have any experience in the real world with sprint cars and torsion bars. And then also one more thing to keep in mind is the shocks. So what you're seeing here is a 3.7 on bump and rebound for the front, and then 5.7 and then 3.7 in the rear. This is the most aggressive that I will be pretty much at any track that I've tried so far. Generally what I like to do with the shocks on all four corners of the car is I will, when I go to a specific track, I load up the default setup, meaning the default race and or qualifying setup. I like to leave the shock values pretty close to what I get, and if anything, the shocks will be the last thing that I adjust. But for here, this is actually, I believe Eldora is the track I decided to load up for today's video. And 3.7 is pretty aggressive with me. Generally speaking, I like to keep the bump somewhere between 3 and 5. I might go up as high as 6, but generally 3 to 5 on all four corners of the car. And then the rebound is usually a couple of clicks higher than that. So something like a 3.5 setup would be pretty standard for me, maybe even a 3.4 or a 3.6, but generally 1 to 2 clicks higher on the rebound than the bump, just as a general rule. Again, this is one of the more aggressive tracks that I got with the rebound simply because the bumps really weren't an issue, so I didn't have to really use the shocks to dial in smoother handling. So keep that in mind. Also, the tire pressures. I like to leave the tire pressures at 10 on the left front, 12 on the right front, and then 4 or 5 in the left rear, and about 9 or 10 in the right rear. Sometimes I will adjust those, and we'll talk about that here in just a second. But as far as adjustments corner to corner, I like to use a little bit lower number on the left front than on the right front. This helps to control the rotation of the car, tighten the car up on corner entry. Here you see I'm using the max right front torsion bar. So the maximum diameter torsion bar on the right front, that tightens the car up on entry. If you're looking to loosen the car on corner entry, then here you have a couple of options with the torsion bar. Number one, you can increase the left front, or you can decrease the right front. So those are a couple of quick adjustments that you can use to loosen the car on corner entry. Now, if you want to tighten the car on corner entry, then you're going to want to increase the torsion bar on the right front, decrease it on the left front. As far as the preload, you notice I'm not using any preload here on the left front, but I'm using maximum preload on the right front. This is, again, another way to tighten the car for me. Decreasing the preload on the right front will loosen up the entry. Increasing the preload on the left front will loosen the entry. So again, a lot of adjustments just talking about the torsion bar itself. But for me, this is generally where I'm going to leave the torsion bars on all 4 corners of the car at each and every track, unless something very different happens, such as maybe we have an extremely high banked track, or maybe no banking at all on a track and I need to loosen up the car. Something along those lines would be needed. But in general, these are the torsion bar settings that I'm going to start each and every track with. Moving on now to the left rear of the car, torsion bar maxed out on the left rear. And then if I go to the right rear, you can see it's a good bit smaller, or a softer torsion bar in the right rear. This is to control the rotation and to control the overall rear bite coming off the corner. So this tightens the car up on corner exit. So essentially what I'm trying to do here is control the rotation of the car when I get back to the gas. I want it tight to feel tighter under throttle, so that's why I'm using a stiffer left rear bar than a right rear bar. So if I wanted to loosen up the car under power or under throttle, then I want to increase the torsion bar in the right rear or decrease the torsion bar on the left rear. Both of those will loosen up the car on under throttle or on exit of the corner. The same thing with the preload here. You see that I'm using max preload in the left rear. Again, that's to control the rotation of the car whenever I get on the gas, because for me, getting back to the throttle causes these cars to jump loose. Now that sounds like a good thing since you're on dirt and you want the car to rotate, but for me it's over-rotating. So I'm using the torsion bar as well as the preload to try to tighten up the car and control that rotation. But again, preload can be used in the same line of thinking as increasing or decreasing the torsion bar itself. Now we already talked about the shocks, but keep in mind here that you notice I'm using a little bit more bump in the left rear than I am in any other corner of the car. That is going to place more load or giving a quicker weight transfer when I get back to the throttle. So once again, that's going to tighten up the car under throttle. So I'm doing a lot of things here to tighten up the car and give me more control of the rotation under power. And then in the tire pressures, one thing that I have had very good luck with is using the left rear PSI in order to adjust how the car drives. The lower the PSI on the left rear, the looser the car will be on corner exit or whenever you are under power or under throttle. The higher the number you use here, the tighter the car will be. I believe the default is 4, which also works very well for me, but every once in a while I will come in and adjust this based on the track. That is the easiest tire pressure for me to adjust and get a good feel out of the car. Now as we move on to the right rear, again I will point out, notice the difference in the torsion bar from left rear to right rear. Much softer or smaller diameter on the right rear than the left rear in order to tighten up the car under power. The next thing to talk about and what we'll focus on is one of the easiest ways to dial in or out a car, and that is the right rear tire stagger. Simply put, I generally like to start out with this at the minimum of 10 inches whenever I go to a track, and then I will increase this as needed. The more you increase the tire stagger, the more the car is going to want to rotate all on its own. So if you're having to turn to the right quite a bit, reducing this number will reduce the amount you're having to turn to the right, particularly on the straightaway. So if you feel like the car is overall just over-rotating, reduce the amount of tire stagger. If you feel like the car is too tight overall and just will not rotate the way you need it, increase the tire stagger, and you will definitely feel a difference as you go up multiple inches. So starting from 10, usually the smallest increments I will go up is a full inch on these in order to be able to feel a difference. But I definitely recommend playing around with this and seeing how much tire stagger is most comfortable for you. Generally speaking, for me, the flatter the track, the more tire stagger I'm likely to use, and the more banking on the track, the lower amount of tire stagger I'm generally going to use. But again, these are very general terms, and every track has its own unique characteristics because in addition to the banking, I also find that the length of the track affects how much stagger. So the longer the track, maybe the more stagger I want to try using because I feel like I can generally carry a little bit more speed through the corners when doing so. But again, the tire stagger is something that you would want to adjust based on your own personal preferences and your driving style. Moving on now to the front of the car. Now, brake bias is going to be a very individual thing. For me, I like to tap the brake just a little bit on corner entry because it helps to control the rotation of the car and settle the front end of the car and get it pointed in the direction that I want. So that's how I use the front brake. With the bias, the higher the number you use on the brake bias, meaning if I went from 35 up to say 40 or 45 and so on, that's going to tighten the car as you're applying the brake. So if the car is over rotating and you want to use the brakes to maybe settle the car and tighten the car a little bit, then increasing the brake bias is a great way to do that. However, if you want to use the brakes in order to turn the car, maybe the car is a little bit too tight on its own and you want to drag the brake a little bit to help the car rotate, then you'll want to lower this number. And the final brake bias percentage you use, again, will depend on your driving style, but those are your generalities. Increase the brake bias to tighten the car under braking, reduce it to loosen the car under braking. Moving on now with front weight, I have left this at maximum at every track I've tried so far. This is generally not something that I'm going to adjust, and the same thing goes with the left weight and the corner weight. So your wedge number is maxed out at 55%. The higher the wedge number or corner weight, the slower the car wants to rotate. So again, this is another way to help me control the rotation of the car. So if I needed the car to rotate more overall, then I would reduce the corner weight to 54%, 53%, and so on. That's going to allow the car to rotate even quicker. But as I've mentioned before, for me, these cars rotate too easily, and I tend to over-rotate the car. So I want to use the corner weight at the maximum in order to control that and tighten up the car overall. Now the tube weight is very interesting for me on this car. I have had no luck in really adjusting it. Now in theory, I would want to lower the tube height because lower heights will reduce the center of gravity. However, in this game, I have actually gotten some weird behavior when playing around with the heights too much. Only in the 305s so far have I noticed that, but I've decided to leave it at 0 at default simply because of that. And to give you an example, at one track, I was adjusting the tube height and sitting still on pit lane before I even moved the car was hopping up and down. So it introduced some weird behavior, and clearly the physics engine wasn't ready for the adjustments that I was making. So I just simply decided to leave it at default. But I'm certainly not telling you that you should not play around with this and just see what works for you. They might very well be a great combination of adjusting the tube height that will give you some more speed. Moving on now to the rear of the car. And again, what I'm showing you are my defaults. And my defaults are maxing out both the left rear and right rear spacing. So in general, here's the way to think of the rear wheel spacing. The more or the higher number you use on the left rear wheel spacing, the tighter the car will be under throttle. The higher the number you use on the right rear spacing, the looser the car will be. The more the car will want to rotate under power and in general overall. So you see, I'm using the max on both the left rear and right rear if I need it, because this gives me some room to play around with the setup and adjust on a per track basis. So let's say I go to a track and using my defaults, the car is just too loose. One of my options and one of my go-tos can be to simply reduce the right rear spacing down to 18.5, 18.0, and so on, because that will tighten up the car overall. If I go to a track and the car is under rotating, it is too tight, then an option is to reduce the left rear spacing to a 14.0, 13.5, and so on, and that will free the car up overall. And then as we move into the last two areas, the miscellaneous and then the gears, keep in mind that number one, the gears are going to be different based on the track, the size of the track, the amount of banking, the overall speed that you're carrying. So don't put any real weight to the rear end ratio that you see on the screen. This is very much a track specific thing. And what I have found is the baseline setup that the track gives me whenever I start off with a custom race or a custom qualifying setup is usually pretty good. I might have to adjust it a few clicks here or there. But the biggest thing to keep in mind about the gears is that the more you increase this number, going from 4.8 up to a 4.9 or a 5.0, this will increase the amount of RPMs you're turning. So this is all about getting close to that red line without hitting the red line too hard and taking away some of your straightaway speed. So again, this is a very individual thing. I don't like to hit the rev limiter very hard, if at all, on corner entry. So I like to back off the RPMs just a little bit because it helps to smooth out the handling of the car for me. I find that the more RPMs I'm turning, specifically if I'm hitting the rev limiter hard, it makes the car looser and more erratic overall. So I will generally back off one click, sometimes two, depending on the track, just to smooth out the handling because it gives me a better feel under throttle. And then the miscellaneous is a very individual setting, particularly with the wheel lock. The higher the number on the wheel lock, the quicker the rotation of the wheel is going to be, meaning the less wheel you're going to have to use to turn the car. So with a higher number here, you see, I believe 18 degrees is the default, and I simply built the setup around that. But if I increase this up to something like, say, 25 or 30 and so on, then I'm going to get a lot quicker steering out of the car, and meaning I'm going to have to use less wheel and be much more precise. However, if I lower this number to somewhere around like say 12 or even lower, then I'm going to get slower steering, meaning I'm going to need to turn the wheel more in order to get the same reaction from the car. And the good news for that is that you don't have to be quite as precise. You can, if you're the type of driver that likes to use the wheel a lot, and you find yourself sawing on the wheel more, then a lower number will probably suit you better. Now, as far as the steering offset, I haven't really used this at any track yet. However, the steering offset is likely going to be tied very heavily to what you use for tire stagger. More tire stagger, more steering offset in general, if you want to use the steering offset at all. Like I said, I have not used it at any track so far because in general, I don't spend enough time on the straightaways to really notice how far to the right I'm turning the wheel. But if you don't like turning the wheel to the right very much at all, then simply increase the steering offset, and that should reduce the amount of turn to the right that you have. So again, this is going to be very much a personal preference. Now the tire compound, I've left it soft and really have found no reason to change this. We don't really have tire wear in the game. In fact, on the dirt tracks, you can't even see the tire temperatures in the tire a lot of times. So there's really nothing to go by that would make me want to use a harder compound. In theory, the softer compound would have more grip, but the lap times, the wear would be greater, so your lap times would fall off a lot quicker than a harder compound. But again, in the game, I have not seen anything to indicate that this is actually happening. And I've run a few full 100% races and have not noticed anything. So really no reason that I've seen to change the tire compound from that soft tire. So that's going to do it for today. Again, this is a baseline setup for the 305 car, and hopefully as we've gone through the different areas of the car, you now have a lot of different ways that you can adjust the car to fit your particular driving style and the feel that you're looking for. So thank you guys so much for joining me, and stick around for more SRX the game.